The relationship between the German army and the new political power rising in Berlin began marked by a prudent distance and mutual distrust. The generals observed the scene without intervening, convinced that their institution would remain the immovable bastion of the state. That expectation would begin to be strained from the first moment when Hitler assumed the leadership of the government, when the top ranks of the Reichswehr looked at him with a mixture of professional skepticism and strategic caution. On the 30th of January 1933, when Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor, the Reichswehr observed the change of government from a cautious position. In the upper ranks, there were no signs of enthusiasm, but neither were there signs of immediate alarm. A professional detachment built over years prevailed, in which politics was seen as an alien and volatile field. For the German officers, accustomed to operating under stable principles and defined hierarchies, the rise of the new chancellor represented an event external to their essential mission, maintaining the institutional continuity of an army conceived as a servant of the state and not of parties. The Reichswehr remained limited by the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, with a maximum of 100,000 personnel without tanks, military aviation or submarines. It was a force operating under strict parameters. These limitations, far from eroding its structure, had reinforced the selective nature of the corps. The reduced number of positions demanded a rigorous filter that only allowed the most qualified officers to remain. Most came from families that had served for generations and had been trained in academies where military technique, discipline, and the Prussian ideal of duty held a central place. Under these restrictions, the army functioned as a cohesive professional elite, convinced of guarding a tradition that spanned governments and regime changes. That Prussian legacy maintained a clear separation between the military and the political. Although many officers shared nationalist convictions and openly criticized the Weimar parliamentary system in private conversations, they understood that their opinions were irrelevant to the state's decision-making process. Their identity was based on institutional continuity, obedience to the legal order, and the preservation of professional standards. From that perspective, mass movements, partisan propaganda, and street agitation were phenomena incompatible with the sobriety they considered essential for the conduct of a modern army. The rise of Hitler, therefore, introduced a disruptive element. He was not a member of the military aristocracy, lacked training in military academies, and had built his power through mass speeches, symbols of political mobilization, and paramilitary structures. For the leaders of the Reichswehr, he stood out from any known reference within the professional world they inhabited. His origins as a corporal in the First World War were not enough to generate respect in an institution where strategic competence was measured by formal studies, technical experience, and doctrinal expertise. The rhetorical style of the new chancellor, marked by intense gesticulation and emotional slogans, reinforced the perception of leadership based on social mobilization rather than structural understanding of the state. Despite these reticences, many generals assumed that Hitler would be just another chancellor within the political instability that had characterized the Weimar Republic. They had gone through successive weak governments eroded by parliamentary rivalries. It was reasonable to think that the relationship with the new head of government would remain on the same terms: limited cooperation and full autonomy in military matters. As long as the army remained the armed force of the state and maintained its professional structure, they could coexist with any civilian leadership. However, the situation evolved in an unexpected direction. Hitler did not come to power through an uprising that the army could evaluate according to operational criteria. He came through agreements with conservative political elites who underestimated his ability to reconfigure the state apparatus. From the first months, his government began to alter the balance between institutions. The National Socialist Party penetrated ministries, occupied administrative spaces, and extended the influence of organizations like the SA, which grew exponentially as a paramilitary force linked to the party. This dynamic worried the Reichswehr, not because of the ideological content of the new regime, but because it blurred the traditional separation between state and political movement. The tension became evident when Ernst Röhm, head of the SA, promoted the idea of integrating his organization into the regular army. The SA reached several million members, made up largely of unemployed veterans and young party sympathizers. Röhm aspired to transform this mass into the base of a new people's army that would replace the professional structure. The proposal meant completely altering the nature of the Reichswehr, substituting technical criteria with party loyalties and subordinating the chain of command to a political movement. For the Prussian officers, this represented an intolerable break with the model that had sustained the German army since the 18th century. The reaction of the High Command was firm. They informed Hitler that they would not accept the integration of the SA into the regular army and that the existence of a partisan militia interfered with institutional stability. The Chancellor then understood that he had to choose between Rome's revolutionary aspirations and the support of the army, which remained a fundamental actor for the consolidation of the regime. He opted to neutralize the threat. The crisis culminated in the Night of the Long Knives, between the 30th of June and the 2nd of July of 1934. The SS arrested and executed Röhm and numerous leaders of the SA. The operation also included the elimination of political figures considered hostile, such as the former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher, retired general, and Ferdinand von Bredow, former high-ranking military officer. The purge was carried out without trials or formal processes, setting a precedent in which lethal decisions were executed outside the German legal system. The reaction of the Reichswehr was complex. The elimination of the SA as a military alternative strengthened its position as the only legitimate armed force of the Reich. However, the methods used generated discomfort. The murder of retired officers without legal guarantees clashed with the Prussian legal tradition. There were private comments of disapproval and signs of unease, although no open opposition. Werner von Blomberg, Minister of Defense, publicly expressed his support for Hitler, a gesture that many considered an excessive show of alignment. Other commanders remained silent, aware that any criticism lacked collective support and could be interpreted as a direct challenge to the regime. A few weeks after the purge, the death of President Paul von Hindenburg allowed Hitler to merge the positions of Chancellor and President, concentrating the supreme authority of the state in his figure. In that context, he summoned the High Command to impose a new oath of loyalty, directed not to the Constitution, nor to Germany as an abstract entity, but to him as Führer. The text stipulated unconditional obedience and a willingness to risk life in personal fulfillment of that commitment. The order was communicated as an administrative requirement, but it implied a profound transformation that irreversibly altered the relationship between the army and political power. The personal oath of August of 1934 altered the historical basis of obedience within the German army. Since the 19th century, soldiers had pledged allegiance to the state or the constitution, abstract frameworks that allowed orders to be interpreted within a higher legal hierarchy. The new formula eliminated that intermediation and directly linked each military person to the person of Adolf Hitler. For an institution where the word given had a central value, that commitment became a disciplinary element of considerable weight. Although its implementation was presented as an administrative procedure, it transformed the nature of the relationship between the army and political power, reducing the spaces of autonomy that had characterized the officer corps for decades. The consolidation of this process depended on institutional changes that developed gradually during the following years. Werner von Blomberg, Minister of War, acted as an intermediary between Hitler and the military establishment, convinced that full collaboration was the most stable way to preserve the army's influence in the new regime. Under his direction, the Nazi salute was introduced and symbolic practices were promoted that reinforced political identification with the Reich's leadership. Blomberg also promoted the promotion of officers sympathetic to the movement, creating an internal environment where ideological alignment gained ground over traditional professional criteria. The Ministry of War began to function more as a disciplined conductor of the Führer's directives than as a consultative body. In 1938, a series of scandals orchestrated from the security structures of the regime led to the simultaneous dismissal of Blomberg and the commander-in-chief of the army, Werner von Fritsch. Blomberg's marriage, questioned by his wife's past background, and the fabricated accusations against Fritsch, presented as verifiable facts, were used to present both as compromised figures. Hitler took advantage of these circumstances to completely reorganize the military command without resorting to violent purges. The forced resignations and administrative pressure were enough to displace two high-ranking officials who, while being collaborators, still represented links with the institutional tradition prior to 1934. The vacuum created by these dismissals allowed the abolition of the Ministry of War and the establishment of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW, conceived to centralize military authority under Hitler's direct supervision. The leadership of the new body fell to Wilhelm Keitel, an officer whose career had been marked by bureaucratic efficiency rather than participation in strategic design. Keitel assumed the position with absolute readiness to translate the Führer's orders into operational instructions without raising objections. The OKW meetings did not encourage critical debate. They constituted spaces where Hitler presented already made decisions, and Keitel took charge of implementing them with the support of an administrative structure designed to eliminate any form of deliberation. The existence of the OKW practically reduced the authority of the Oberkommando der Heer, the OKH, which until then had been the main operational planning center of the army. The overlap of functions between both organizations generated an ambiguous chain of command that Hitler used to preserve his personal control. When discrepancies arose, he acted as the supreme arbiter, reinforcing his position by preventing a single institution from accumulating enough power to contradict him. This fragmented system did not respond to military efficiency criteria, but to a model of government where personal leadership centralized all decisions of relevance. The rearrangement of leadership was accompanied by a selective process that altered the profile of the officer corps. Those who showed a willingness to adapt to the new conditions advanced quickly. Those who held reservations experienced stagnation or were moved to secondary functions. It was not necessary to profess absolute ideological adherence to rise, but rather to demonstrate unequivocal loyalty to the Führer's decisions. Gradually, descendants of aristocratic families trained in imperial academies were replaced by younger officers, oriented towards the disciplined execution of orders rather than the preservation of corporate traditions. While transforming administrative structures, the regime promoted an unprecedented military expansion. With the reintroduction of compulsory service in 1935 and the public announcement of the Luftwaffe, Germany de facto abandoned the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. The Reichswehr became the Wehrmacht in a rapid growth process that altered the scale and internal functioning of the armed forces. Reactivated factories and arsenals produced tanks, planes, and artillery in quantities that no officer had seen since the First World War. The expansion offered opportunities to a generation of commanders eager to apply modern doctrines. Heinz Guderian, for example, developed panzer divisions based on the concentration of armored units to achieve rapid breakthroughs, an idea previously considered marginal. Other specialists introduced improvements in motorized artillery, radio communications, and air coordination, elements that formed the basis of an evolving mechanized warfare. The acquisition of resources, the possibility of testing innovative tactics, and the expectation of large-scale operations reinforced the perception that the regime provided the army with tools that no previous government had been able to offer. That material dependency generated an additional incentive for compliance. Hitler controlled access to the industrial and budgetary resources that allowed the military modernization to materialize. Criticizing his policies could be interpreted as a challenge that would jeopardize that flow of supplies. Many officers adopted a pragmatic stance, maintaining cooperation to sustain the technological advancement of the army. Modernization was not just a military end, it became an internal argument that justified the increasingly close relationship between the political leadership and the military establishment. In parallel, the regime introduced internal policies that profoundly altered the legal and social structure of the Reich. The Nuremberg laws institutionalized racial discrimination. Repression against opponents was intensified by security forces with broad powers, and concentration camps expanded their functions and population. Some members of the High Command privately expressed reservations, but most adopted the position that these matters were outside their scope of responsibility. The army focused on rearmament and operational preparation, while political transformations followed their course without significant interference from the military structure. By 1938, the subordination of the army was an accomplished fact. The personal oath had redefined individual obligations. The OKW was the tool that translated Hitler's will into military orders. Promotions reflected the priority of obedience over professional tradition. The expansion of armament had tied the army's institutional destiny to the Führer's political decisions. The Wehrmacht, while still retaining a technical component of excellence, had lost its ability to act as an institutional counterbalance. At the higher command levels, doubts persisted about certain methods and decisions, but these reservations did not translate into organized resistance. It remained to be seen how such a transformed structure would react when diplomatic crises first tested the relationship between political leadership and the professional assessment of strategic risks. The first serious test for the relationship between the German High Command and the political leadership emerged in the summer of 1938. Hitler had focused his attention on Czechoslovakia, particularly in the Sudetenland region, where a German-speaking population served as the main argument for his territorial demands. For months, the Führer increased diplomatic pressure, insisting that the incorporation of the Sudetenland was necessary to guarantee the Reich's interests. To the international community, this seemed like another calculated maneuver aimed at obtaining concessions without resorting to force. Within the army, however, more cautious evaluations began to emerge. For several officers, the crisis did not represent a strategic opportunity, but rather the concrete risk of a European war for which Germany was not fully prepared. Among those who adopted that stance was Ludwig Beck, chief of the Army General Staff. His analysis did not respond to ideological considerations or personal conflicts with Hitler, but to a strictly technical evaluation. Beck examined production reports, levels of training, availability of reserves, and the capacity to sustain prolonged operations. He concluded that Germany was not in a position to face France and Great Britain simultaneously in defense of an annexation that, from his perspective, lacked military urgency. To support his diagnosis, he drafted detailed memoranda where he synthesized the real state of preparedness of the Wehrmacht and projected conflict scenarios. In all of them, a war in 1938 placed the Reich in an unfavorable position. The memorandums circulated among the senior leadership. Some shared their conclusions and viewed with skepticism the idea of initiating offensive operations in such an uncertain context. Others considered that Beck's analysis underestimated the army's potential, or that ultimately the Western powers would not come to the defense of Czechoslovakia. Hitler dismissed the technical evaluation and maintained his diplomatic pressure. For him, the issue was not a calculation of capabilities, but a demonstration of political will. Beck then found himself in a position that generated a professional dilemma. He had advised rigorously and had been ignored. Remaining in his post implied silently accepting a decision he considered wrong from a military standpoint. In that context, Beck attempted an unusual move in the German military tradition. He proposed to some of his colleagues to submit simultaneous resignations to force the Führer to reconsider his stance. The initiative posed an extraordinary institutional challenge. It was not about disobeying operational orders, but about creating a crisis within the command that would force a rethink of a political decision with great strategic impact. Beck argued that, faced with such a high risk to the country's security, the officers had an obligation to intervene through administrative means. However, the proposal lacked the necessary support. Some generals expressed understanding of his concern, but they considered that a collective resignation would undermine fundamental principles of discipline. Others feared losing their career without achieving any change. Walter von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the army, initially showed interest but withdrew when he saw that the initiative would not reach consensus. The lack of support left Beck without alternatives. He submitted his resignation in August of 1938. Hitler accepted it but ordered to keep it secret during the crisis to avoid reflecting internal divisions. The result was the silent departure of one of the most respected officers in the army. Those who remained in their positions understood that the political leadership would not tolerate dissonant positions, even when expressed through strictly professional analysis. Beck's resignation sent a clear message. Reasoned opposition, if it interfered with the Führer's plans, had no place within the command structure. Even so, his departure did not eliminate the concerns within the army. Some officers, especially in the Abwehr, considered that the situation required more forceful measures. Among them were Hans Oster, colonel of the Military Intelligence Service, and Wilhelm Canaris, its director. Both assessed that if Hitler led the country to a premature war, it would be necessary to prevent him from making irreversible decisions. The conversations between Oster, Canaris, and a few collaborators were kept in extremely small circles. There was no talk of a formal conspiracy yet, but discussions about future possibilities were emerging. How the army would react to an order for general mobilization, what impact a declaration of war from the Western powers would have, or what mechanisms could be activated to stop decisions that exceeded the limits of strategic prudence. From these conversations emerged a preliminary plan. If Hitler ordered the invasion of Czechoslovakia and the operation triggered a war in Europe, a group of officers would mobilize to arrest him. They would not present the action as an armed coup, but as a necessary intervention to prevent an incapacitated leader from leading the country to disaster. A provisional government, probably made up of figures known for their professionalism, would seek to negotiate a diplomatic way out. The scheme depended on multiple factors that needed to align and lacked a solid operational structure. However, it represented a significant change. For the first time since 1933, German officers discussed the possibility of using state resources to limit the power of the Führer. The development of the crisis showed that the necessary conditions to activate that plan did not materialize. At the Munich Conference, held in September of 1938, Great Britain and France accepted the German territorial demands. Czechoslovakia, without direct participation in the negotiation, was forced to cede the Sudets. The annexation was completed without military confrontations. Hitler interpreted the outcome as proof that his pressure strategy was working. For the officers who had considered intervening, the outcome weakened their arguments. The war they had predicted did not occur. The technical analysis had been overridden by political decisions made outside their control. The immediate consequence was the deactivation of any attempt at organized opposition. Beck had resigned, anticipating a war that did not take place. The generals who had weighed a collective action now saw that the Führer had achieved another success without resorting to arms. The budding network gathered by Oster lost momentum. Although some of its members maintained their reservations about the country's political conduct, those reservations were relegated to private discussions without operational translation. The situation changed abruptly 6 months later. In March of 1939, Hitler ordered the occupation of the rest of Czechoslovakia. This action was not justified by claims about German minorities, nor presented as a response to border conflicts. It was the direct absorption of a sovereign state, demonstrating that the promises made in Munich were not in effect. The Western powers protested, but did not resort to military measures. The operation reinforced Hitler's internal prestige as he had expanded German territory without facing significant resistance. For the officers who had valued opposing during the Sudeten crisis, the contrast was evident. The warnings they had made months earlier seemed mistaken in light of the evidence that the Führer continued achieving strategic objectives without immediate costs. In that environment, dissent became increasingly difficult to sustain even in private. The military leadership observed how political decisions were yielding results that exceeded traditional technical calculations. The question no longer revolved around strategic prudence, but around the unexpected effectiveness of a method that combined political risk and diplomatic pressure. That perception, widespread among many commanders, had lasting consequences. The space to formulate objections narrowed even further, and the conviction that Hitler understood international dynamics better than they did gained ground, creating a climate where reservations were diluted in the face of visible results. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany began the invasion of Poland. 2 days later, Great Britain and France declared war in fulfillment of their guarantees, setting up a general conflict that many German officers had feared since the Sudeten crisis. However, the development of operations contradicted those initial predictions. Poland was defeated in less than 1 month through a combination of rapid armored attacks and decisive air support that disrupted the Polish command capability. The panzer divisions advanced with unprecedented coordination, exploiting breaches in enemy lines and encircling units before they could reorganize. The Luftwaffe attacked communication centers, depots, and railway junctions, reducing Polish mobility and accelerating the collapse of their defenses. Meanwhile, France and Great Britain remained practically inactive on the Western Front, adopting a waiting strategy that allowed Germany to concentrate resources in the east. Heinz Guderian played a central role in that campaign. In command of the 19th Corps, he used advanced command vehicles to oversee operations at close range and maintain continuous communication with the panzer units. The mobility and speed of his divisions allowed deep penetrations into Polish territory, enveloping enemy formations through maneuvers that surpassed the adversary's reaction speed. Cities considered important defensive points were captured quickly, and the Polish units attempting to establish lines of resistance found themselves overwhelmed before completing their deployments. The effectiveness of these operations validated the doctrine that Guderian had advocated for years and showed that mechanized warfare could radically alter traditional procedures. After the Poland campaign, the Western Front remained stable for several months. While the French and British armies entrenched themselves behind the Maginot Line, the German High Command planned operations aimed at securing strategic positions. In April of 1940, Germany occupied Denmark and Norway through a combination of amphibious landings, airborne actions, and coordinated ground movements. Denmark capitulated almost immediately, while Norway offered more prolonged resistance before coming under German control. With these operations, the Reich secured access to essential resources, such as Swedish iron ore, and obtained naval bases of clear value for future campaigns. The decisive attack occurred in May of 1940 with the offensive against France and the Netherlands. The initial plan, which followed more conventional patterns, was replaced by a proposal from Erich von Manstein that suggested concentrating armoured forces in the Ardennes sector. This region, considered difficult for heavy vehicles, offered a strategic advantage. The French had underestimated it and had deployed units with limited equipment there. Manstein proposed sending the panzer divisions through that terrain, crossing the Meuse and advancing towards the English Channel, enveloping the bulk of Allied forces in Belgium. Guderian led the advance through the Ardennes. For days, his columns moved through narrow, wooded routes that made them vulnerable to possible air attacks, but the lack of French anticipation avoided that risk. On the 13th of May, 3 days after the start of the offensive, German forces crossed the Meuse at Sedan. From that point, the campaign took on a pace that exceeded the expectations of the High Command itself. The panzer divisions advanced dozens of kilometers daily, disrupting the enemy's operational balance and preventing French troops from organizing coherent defensive lines. The speed of the advance made decisions that previously required hours of planning irrelevant. Traditional procedures, designed for a positional war, proved ineffective against the German mobility. On the 20th of May, German units reached the English Channel at Abbeville, cutting off communication between the Allied armies in Belgium and the main French forces. The resulting encirclement trapped hundreds of thousands of British, French, and Belgian soldiers in an area that was rapidly shrinking. The campaign, which had begun with uncertainty, was about to produce a far-reaching strategic victory. In that phase of the operation, an episode occurred that revealed structural tensions between Hitler and his field commanders. Guderian wanted to continue toward Dunkirk to capture the ports and nullify any possibility of evacuation, arguing that the Allied forces were disorganized and that maintaining the pressure was crucial. On May 24th, he received a direct order from Hitler stopping the armored advance. The order was officially justified by logistical considerations and the idea of preserving the panzer divisions for future operations. Some commanders speculated that the terrain near Dunkirk could complicate the movement of armoured units. However, the field commanders, including Guderian, saw the decision as interference that did not respond to operational criteria. The Luftwaffe tried to compensate for the halt with air attacks, but the opportunity for a total destruction of the Allied contingent was reduced with each day of delay. The British consolidated a defensive perimeter and organized Operation Dynamo. When the resumption of the German advance was finally authorized, the window of opportunity had decreased significantly. Between the end of May and the beginning of June, more than 300,000 Allied troops were evacuated to Great Britain. The British operation did not alter the overall outcome of the campaign, but it did prevent the complete elimination of the expeditionary forces that would later play an important role in the continuation of the war. After Dunkirk, the German offensive moved south. On the 5th of June, a new phase of the campaign began, French resistance was more organized but insufficient to contain the German momentum. Paris fell on the 14th of June without prolonged urban confrontations. On the 22nd of June, France signed an armistice that consolidated German control over much of the territory. In 6 weeks, the Wehrmacht had defeated one of the largest military powers on the continent. These victories had profound effects on the behavior of the High Command. Beck had warned in 1938 that Germany could not sustain a European conflict. Reality had been different. The army had achieved results that contradicted previous forecasts and even exceeded internal expectations. The speed of operations, the effectiveness of mechanized forces, and the Allied inability to react in time reinforced the perception that Hitler possessed superior strategic judgment. For many officers, the doubts expressed years earlier seemed out of place. Those who had questioned the Führer's decisions were relegated by a narrative based on accumulated successes that reinforced political supremacy over professional authority. The consensus generated by the victories of 1939 and 1940 began to erode when Hitler turned his attention towards the Soviet Union. On the 22nd of June 1941, Operation Barbarossa was initiated, an offensive aimed at defeating the Soviet state in a single campaign by means of 3 simultaneous axes of advance towards Leningrad, Moscow, and the strategic resources of the South. The OKH had developed meticulous plans based on the recent experience of mechanized warfare, but from the start faced a command structure where Hitler's priorities prevailed over operational principles. The campaign was not conceived solely as a military operation, but as a political and ideological project of enormous scope. The first point of friction arose around the strategic objectives. Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, argued that the main offensive should be directed against Moscow, the center of the Soviet communications system and a key point for the regime's stability. From his perspective, capturing the capital could disrupt Soviet command capabilities and accelerate a general collapse. Hitler rejected this interpretation. He deemed it a priority to occupy Ukraine for its agricultural and industrial production, while Leningrad had a symbolic value aligned with his ideological view of the conflict. The result was a campaign without a single decisive objective, with forces distributed between goals that responded to political interests rather than strictly military criteria. The guidelines issued before the start of the operation further widened the gap between professional command and political leadership. The order of the commissars instructed the execution without trial of captured Soviet commissars. Other directives exempted German soldiers from criminal responsibility for actions against civilians. These orders broke with traditions of the German army in previous conflicts, imposing an ideological component that caused discomfort in sectors of the High Command. Johannes Blaskowitz had previously protested against atrocities committed by SS units in Poland, documenting abuses and noting that they undermined military discipline. His career stalled because of that opposition. During Barbarossa, commanders like Fedor von Bock expressed reservations about the orders but chose not to formally confront the political leadership. In many cases, the command allowed the SS to carry out directives they did not want to implement directly, creating a system of functional separation that avoided open confrontations but did not stop the implementation of the policies. The initial advances seemed to validate Hitler's optimism. Within weeks, the panzer divisions penetrated hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory. Successive encirclements in areas like Minsk and Smolensk captured hundreds of thousands of soldiers. By August, the German front showed a depth that no prior operation had reached. However, these successes concealed structural problems. The distances exceeded any planner's expectations. The rains turned roads into mudflats that slowed movements. The Soviet railway gauge made supply transportation difficult, and Soviet reserves emerged at a speed that surprised the OKH, accustomed to enemies whose ability to replace destroyed forces was more limited. The tension between strategic priorities intensified in September. When Army Group Center was approaching Moscow, Hitler ordered armored units to be diverted south to complete the encirclement of Kiev. Halder argued that this decision shifted critical efforts away from the central objective and dispersed offensive capability just at the decisive moment. Hitler insisted on completing the operation in Ukraine. The encirclement of Kiev produced an enormous number of prisoners, but delayed the offensive towards Moscow. When it resumed in October under the name Operation Typhoon, the autumn rains had begun and the advance became slow. The panzer forces were getting stuck in the mud and the supply was becoming irregular. The difficulties multiplied when winter arrived. Temperatures dropped sharply. The promised winter equipment did not reach the units. Vehicles suffered mechanical failures because the lubricants froze. Automatic weapons jammed due to the extreme cold. Mobility was drastically reduced. Commanders sent reports describing units on the verge of physical exhaustion, positions impossible to hold without reinforcements, and supply lines collapsed by insurmountable distances. The situation demanded tactical withdrawals to shorten fronts and reorganize forces. Hitler responded with an order that would become a hallmark of his military leadership: the absolute prohibition of retreats. The units had to hold their positions without considering the local conditions. Tactical flexibility, a fundamental principle of German military doctrine, was nullified. Guderian, in command of the 2nd Panzer Army, urgently requested authorization to withdraw to more sustainable defensive positions. In the absence of a response, he traveled personally to present his situation. The meeting with Hitler highlighted the depth of the rift. Guderian argued that withdrawal was essential to preserve his forces. Hitler rejected all the explanations, affirming that willpower was more important than material considerations. Shortly afterward, Guderian was relieved of his command. The winter of 1941 marked a turning point. Hitler dismissed more than 30 generals who had requested withdrawal permits or had ordered limited retreats. Walter von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the army, resigned after a health crisis caused by the constant pressure of mediating between commanders and political leadership. Hitler then took direct command of the army, eliminating the formal separation between political and military authority. From that moment on, operational decisions were centralized in his office, regardless of the information coming from the front. The distance between the headquarters location and the combat lines worsened the problems. Hitler made decisions based on filtered and frequently outdated reports. Commanders had to request authorization for maneuvers that under normal conditions would be resolved in minutes. The communication chains delayed the transmission of orders, reducing the ability to react to Soviet movements. However, the rigid structure prevented local adaptations. In many cases, the commanders opted to apply discrete tactics of partial compliance, modify orders to allow essential maneuvers, delay the implementation of impossible directives, or take advantage of the front's confusion to gain small margins of autonomy. These practices, although alleviating some critical situations, could not change the general dynamic in which Hitler occupied the absolute center of the decision-making process. The offensive towards Moscow was finally halted when Soviet units launched counterattacks in December. The German front stabilized, but at an enormous cost. Leningrad remained besieged without falling. Moscow resisted despite successive offensives. The south offered territorial advances, but not the strategic collapse sought. By the spring of 1942, the Wehrmacht maintained deep positions in Soviet territory, but had suffered severe losses in men and equipment. The panzer units, crucial to previous victories, were reduced to fractions of their original strength. The accumulated wear indicated that the operational model that had produced such rapid successes had clear limits when faced with an adversary capable of absorbing enormous losses and reorganizing quickly. The 1942 summer campaign represented the last German attempt to achieve a strategic decision on the Eastern Front. Hitler ordered an offensive divided into two axes, one directed towards the oil fields of the Caucasus and the other towards Stalingrad on the western bank of the Volga. This fragmentation contradicted basic principles of concentration of forces but reflected the Führer's growing tendency to impose political and economic objectives over operational criteria. The OKH commands recorded reservations about the dispersion, although the dynamics established since the previous winter made any structured opposition unlikely. The function of the General Staff had been reduced to implementing directives coming from the headquarters without effective margin for correction. The Sixth Army, under the command of Friedrich Paulus, advanced towards Stalingrad throughout the summer. The city constituted an extensive industrial hub with factories and densely built neighborhoods that limited mobility. The Soviet defenders transformed each facility into a fortified point. The German units, adapted for mechanized warfare in open fields, lost their advantages in urban combat that developed room by room. The artillery created ruins that further hindered maneuverability. The accumulated wear and tear quickly emerged. High casualties, a growing shortage of ammunition, and extended supply lines that depended on routes vulnerable to Soviet attacks and partisan activity. By October, most of Stalingrad was in German hands, but at a significant operational cost. Entire divisions had been reduced to minimum strength. The Sixth Army's flanks were guarded by Romanian and Italian formations with limited capacity to repel strong attacks. Reports sent to the OKH highlighted the vulnerability of this configuration. Soviet intelligence identified these weaknesses and planned an offensive aimed at breaking the less protected points of the German setup. On the 19th of November, Operation Uranus began. Soviet forces attacked simultaneously to the north and south of Stalingrad. The Romanian defences collapsed within a matter of hours, unable to withstand the weight of the offensive. 4 days later, the Soviet columns met in Kalach, completing the encirclement of the Sixth Army. Close to 300,000 Axis troops were isolated in a wide but fragile perimeter, without sufficient reserves and with compromised supply lines. Paulus requested immediate authorization to break the encirclement before it was fully consolidated. Hitler rejected the request. He ordered the Sixth Army to hold its positions to pin down Soviet forces, while an external counterattack was prepared. The Luftwaffe, under the command of Hermann Göring, assured that it could supply the Sixth Army via an air bridge. Technical calculations showed that the available transport capacity could not sustain the necessary daily volume of supplies. In addition, nearby airfields were under constant artillery fire and air attacks. Despite this, the promise was accepted without operational adjustments, and the order to stand firm was maintained. Paulus complied with the directive. His staff training, his career in structures where obedience was a central norm, and the personal oath to Hitler converged in the impossibility of executing a withdrawal without explicit authorization. Meanwhile, the encirclement became progressively more rigid. The supply flights delivered only a fraction of the material required. Temperatures plummeted sharply in December. The extreme cold affected the operability of weapons, vehicles, and personnel. Rations decreased to minimal levels. The combat capability was drastically reduced because the physical wear and tear exceeded any possible replacement rate. In parallel, Army Group Don, under Erich von Manstein, launched an operation to break the encirclement from the outside. By mid-December, its units reached about 50 kilometers from the lines of the Sixth Army. The final distance depended on Paulus attempting a coordinated breakout from within. However, Paulus did not have authorization from Hitler to abandon his positions. Manstein reported that he could not advance further without compromising the integrity of his own forces. The offensive was halted and the Sixth Army was definitively trapped. Within the perimeter, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The defensive positions were reduced as the Soviets advanced. The lack of ammunition limited any attempt at a counterattack. The casualties from frostbite increased. Physical exhaustion prevented maintaining extended guard shifts. The reports described units unable to hold the line due to lack of physical capacity rather than adverse tactical decisions. By the end of January of 1943, the command structure of the Sixth Army was operating with irregular communications and practically non-existent reserves. On January 30th, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. It was a gesture full of symbolism. No German marshal had been captured alive in the country's military history. The promotion implied an implicit expectation of final resistance. The following day, Soviet forces stormed his headquarters. Paulus surrendered along with his staff. Of the hundreds of thousands of encircled soldiers, only a fraction survived Soviet captivity in the following years. The fall of Stalingrad irreversibly altered the perception of Hitler's leadership within the army. The operation, which initially was supposed to secure the Volga line, ended with the collapse of an entire army. The outcome exposed the consequences of decisions that had ignored technical warnings about flank vulnerability, logistical capacity, and the need for maneuver. The defeat was not interpreted as an inevitable consequence of external forces, but as a direct effect of rigid leadership that had deprived commanders of the necessary flexibility to respond to rapid changes at the front. While events were unfolding in Stalingrad, The situation in North Africa was evolving in parallel. Erwin Rommel, whose operations in the desert had gained international recognition, faced a British adversary that had significantly increased its availability of material and troops. Rommel had reported since the previous year that limited logistics made it impossible to sustain prolonged offensives. Requests for reinforcements went unanswered, as the effort in the east absorbed most of the resources. In October of 1942, British forces launched their offensive in El Alamein. The Axis lines gave way under a volume of fire and reserves that clearly exceeded the available capabilities. The German retreat continued westward for months. In February of 1943, Rommel was withdrawn from command for official health reasons. The decision left the North African theatre in the hands of other commanders at a time of increasing pressure. In May, Axis forces in Tunisia capitulated. More than 200,000 German and Italian troops were captured. The defeat completely eliminated the Axis presence in North Africa and opened a direct route for future Allied operations in the Mediterranean. These losses altered the global strategic balance. The myth of invincibility that had politically protected Hitler since 1940 eroded decisively. The Allied industry surpassed German capacity in armaments, vehicles, and aircraft. The Soviet Union maintained numerically superior forces. German cities faced increasing bombings. The generals understood that the prospect of total victory was progressively disappearing. However, proposing strategic alternatives was impractical within a system where questioning the Führer meant immediate dismissal. In this environment, Hitler further reduced the operating margin of the general staff. Halder had been relieved in September of 1942 and replaced by Kurt Zeitzler. The operational meetings had turned into unilateral presentations where Hitler detailed specific movements and rejected assessments that did not match his expectations. The generals adopted strategies of cautious presentation, adjusting reports to avoid accusations of defeatism and prioritizing data that mitigated adverse reactions. The formal structure of the German command still existed, but its real influence diminished as decision-making moved towards an increasingly centralized model. In this climate of distrust, professional frustration, and operational deterioration, discrete contacts began to emerge among officers who shared the conviction that the course of the conflict demanded actions different from those officially permitted. Although these conversations did not yet constitute an organized movement, they showed a change in the internal perception of the German leadership and announced transformations that would develop in the following months. By mid-1943, a part of the officer corps had come to the conclusion that continuing the war under Hitler's command would lead to an irreversible deterioration of the German state. This diagnosis did not arise from a profound ideological shift, but from the practical realization that the balance of forces had tipped decisively against Germany. The losses in the East, the Soviet industrial superiority, the Anglo-American material pressure, and the increase in bombings on German cities clearly indicated that the possibilities of strategic victory had disappeared. In that context, a growing number of commanders began to consider measures that, until a short time ago, would have seemed unthinkable within an institution whose culture was based on hierarchical obedience and strict respect for the oath of service. The formation of these conspiratorial networks occurred under an environment of constant surveillance. The Gestapo had perfected control methods that reduced privacy to a minimum. Telephone communications could be intercepted. Private correspondence was subject to systematic censorship. Visits between officers and civilians were objects of observation. The risk of investigation for critical comments obliged the adoption of elaborate discretion protocols. Verbal messages transmitted only between trusted individuals, meetings in private homes, deliberate absence of written documents. The conspiracy developed as a fragmented network in cells to reduce the impact of a possible arrest. Hans Oster, colonel of the Abwehr, played a central role in these early structures. For years, Oster had identified officers likely to participate in a movement against Hitler. His position allowed him to assess profiles, observe behaviors, and detect signs of professional discontent. He did not issue direct invitations without multiple filters. He frequently delegated the first contact to personal acquaintances of the interested officers, creating a chain of trust where each link only knew those with whom they dealt directly. This system sought to limit exposure and ensure that information about the existence of the network did not circulate beyond those strictly necessary. Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, knew about these activities, although he rarely intervened in their operational planning. His contribution consisted of offering institutional protection through calculated inaction. Reports requested by the Gestapo were left incomplete. Investigations into certain officers encountered administrative obstacles, and requests for cooperation received late responses. This attitude did not make Canaris a direct architect of the conspiracy, but his tolerance allowed the networks to exist without being discovered in early stages. Ludwig Beck, former chief of the General Staff who had resigned in 1938, became an intellectual reference for many conspirators. Beck did not offer operational support, but articulated the conceptual basis that justified disobedience. He argued that the oath taken to Hitler had lost validity as the Führer had led the country into a war with no possibility of success. He considered that the ultimate responsibility of soldiers was towards Germany as a historical entity, and that this responsibility imposed action when the political leadership became incompatible with national survival. These reflections provided a framework for officers who, even recognizing the need to intervene, needed to integrate that action with their professional training. In parallel, the conspiracy began to connect with civilian circles. Karl Goerdeler, former mayor of Leipzig, became a key figure in that process. After leaving his position due to disagreement with government policies, he maintained a relationship with conservative groups that rejected the course of the regime. His main role was to prepare drafts of a provisional administration that could take control if a military coup succeeded. This included proposals to reorganize ministries, establish discreet contacts with representatives of foreign powers, and draft urgent measures to stabilize the country after a change of leadership. The Kreisau Circle, formed by intellectuals, jurists, and officials such as Helmuth James von Moltke and Peter Joch von Wartenberg, complemented these efforts with discussions on long-term political structures. Although they were not directly involved in the planning of the coup, they contributed conceptual elements that could serve to design a new political system after the collapse of the Nazi regime. Figures such as Julius Leber, coming from the social democratic sphere, were also integrated, whose experience brought balance between military and civilian perspectives within the network. The diversification of participants increased the complexity of the conspiracy and also its risk. Each expansion of the network raised the probability of involuntary betrayal or infiltration. The conspirators were fully aware that the Gestapo prioritized the identification of coordinated groups that could threaten internal stability. The clandestinity required rigorous measures: compartmentalized distribution of information, wide intervals between meetings, use of professional pretexts to justify movements, and rigorous selection of interlocutors. The preservation of the structure depended on a combination of individual prudence and coordination limited to the strictly essential. The military setbacks of 1943 intensified these initiatives. The German offensive in Kursk, launched in July, was the last attempt to regain strategic initiative in the east. The attack concentrated panzer divisions rebuilt after Stalingrad, but Soviet intelligence knew the plan well in advance to build defenses in depth. Minefields, multiple anti-tank positions, and armored reserves prepared for counterattacks drastically limited the German advance. In a matter of days, the offensive lost momentum and Hitler ordered it to be suspended. The defeat at Kursk eliminated any expectation of regaining operational initiative on the Eastern Front. From then on, the Wehrmacht entered a permanent defensive phase, retreating under constant pressure. This process reinforced the conviction of some officers that the war was moving towards an inevitably unfavorable outcome. In that context, Henning von Tresckow, staff officer of Army Group Center, emerged as a key figure. Tresckow had direct experience on the Eastern Front since 1941 and had observed the operational effects of orders that contradicted basic command principles. His participation was decisive because he brought determination, access to operational structures, and knowledge of security procedures on official visits to the front. For him, the physical elimination of Hitler had become a prerequisite to avoid further military and political deterioration. Tresckow organized several assassination attempts during that year. In March, he took advantage of Hitler's visit to the Army Group Center headquarters to place explosives in the Führer's plane hidden inside an apparently innocuous package. The device did not detonate due to failures in the chemical mechanism under low temperatures. Tresco retrieved the device after landing to prevent its origin from being discovered. Shortly after, Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf tried to activate a device during an exhibition of captured weaponry, but Hitler moved through the rooms at a speed that prevented synchronization of the detonator. Other planned attempts, such as that of Axel von dem Buscher during a uniform demonstration, could not be executed due to unforeseen cancellations. These failures did not stop the conspiracy, but highlighted the technical and logistical difficulty of any attack. Security measures were reinforced after each attempt. Access to Hitler was limited and subject to constant changes. Explosive devices required specific conditions to function properly. Physical proximity to the Führer depended on unpredictable circumstances. Nevertheless, the conviction that the military situation demanded immediate action spread within the circles involved. The search for an officer with regular access and the ability to act at the right moment converged on Klaus von Stauffenberg. After the severe injuries suffered in Tunisia in April of 1943, Stauffenberg had been transferred to staff positions. His appointment as Chief of Staff of the Reserve Army in September under General Friedrich Fromm granted him participation in meetings where Hitler received reports on mobilization and unit structure in German territory. The position included administrative authority over reserve troops that could play a key role in operations following an attack. When the conspirators contacted Stauffenberg, they found an officer with firm conviction, operational access, and the ability to integrate military planning with decisive action. His incorporation reorganized priorities, introduced a sense of urgency, and facilitated the transformation of the conspiratorial network into a movement with the intention of executing a concrete plan. The clandestine structure that had taken shape during 1943 thus advanced towards a stage where technical coordination acquired central importance for the events that would unfold in the following months. The incorporation of Klaus von Stauffenberg transformed the conspiratorial work into a defined operational process. Until his arrival, the network had discussed scenarios and possibilities without turning them into executable plans. There was a lack of coordination between political analysis, available military structure, and concrete procedures. Stauffenberg brought experience in detailed planning, knowledge of the real functioning of the Reserve Army, and a clear understanding that a successful coup required synchronization between the elimination of the Führer and immediate control of administrative centers. His role was not only to bring an explosive device to a meeting, but to articulate the technical elements that would make it possible to take advantage of the command vacuum that would occur in the minutes following the attack. The central mechanism for that later phase was Operation Valkyrie. This plan existed before any conspiracy and was designed to mobilize the Reserve Army in the event of an internal emergency situation. Its drafting contemplated uprisings of forced laborers, coordinated sabotage, or severe disruptions of public order. Valkyrie authorized the immediate mobilization of garrison units, securing of government facilities, and detention of individuals catalogued as potential threats. The plan conferred broad competencies on the Reserve Army within Germany in the event of a collapse of civil control, making it the ideal tool for a coup that aimed to present itself as an act of restoration of order. The conspirators, with Stauffenberg, Friedrich Olbricht, and Henning von Tresckow as the main ones responsible for the operational part, modified the Valkyrie orders so that, once activated, they would direct the military apparatus against the regime itself. In the altered version, the emergency would be defined as an attempted coup executed by the SS after the supposed death of Hitler. The Reserve Army was then to mobilize to protect the state, arrest high-ranking members of the SS and the Gestapo, occupy government offices, secure communication media, and establish a provisional administration led by Ludwig Beck. The procedure was not conceived as a break from the regime, but as an institutional continuity aimed at neutralizing an internal threat, an element that facilitated the initial obedience of commanders not informed about the conspiracy. The structure of the plan required precise timing. Orders had to be issued immediately after the attack before the Nazi hierarchy could reorganize. The conspirators estimated they had a few hours to control Berlin. enough to arrest main party leaders, secure the ministries, occupy the national radio, and coordinate military governors in provinces. Any delay would allow key figures like Joseph Goebbels or Heinrich Himmler to issue counter-orders, mobilize loyal forces, or directly communicate to the population the real nature of the events. The operational window was narrow and required meticulous preparation of each phase. Stauffenberg devoted the first months of 1944 to examining the chain of command of the Reserve Army. He identified units that could be quickly mobilized and assessed their commanders based on their reliability. Some were active participants in the conspiracy and knew the real intention of the plan. Others were not informed, but were considered likely to execute Valkyrie's orders without questioning the origin. Separate lists were drawn up: units to carry out arrests, units to occupy communication nodes, units responsible for securing strategic facilities in Berlin and other cities. In occupied regions, trusted officers were to activate their own versions of the plan, ensuring territorial continuity of the operation. One of the main challenges was adapting the command of Berlin to the requirements of the coup. The capital concentrated not only ministries and barracks, but also the SS headquarters, national radios, party offices, and an extensive communications network. The conspiratorial structure required controlling the city in the first hour. To achieve this, Stauffenberg held meetings with officers responsible for guard battalions and training units, explaining their role within the formal framework of Valkyrie without revealing the true intention. The idea was that they would receive orders drafted under official terminology, so that the transition of the regime into the hands of the Reserve Army would occur without initial resistance within the military apparatus. Simultaneously, progress was made in obtaining and preparing the explosive. Tresco had acquired captured British plastic charges whose performance and stability surpassed standard German explosives. The challenge was to adapt the activation mechanism to Stauffenberg's physical limitations, who could only use the 3 fingers of his left hand. The conspirators' technicians, with experience in deactivation and use of detonators, dedicated weeks to modifying the chemical mechanisms to achieve a silent, stable, and quick-to-activate device. The detonator needed to allow for a margin of several minutes between initiation and explosion, enough for Stauffenberg to leave the location, but without exceeding times that would facilitate inspection of the items present in the meeting room. The activation procedure was rehearsed repeatedly. With systematic practice, Stauffenberg managed to break the capsule of the detonator with controlled pressure, initiate the chemical flow, and close the briefcase with discrete movements. Each repetition had a clear goal: to minimize the risks of error in an environment where he would be surrounded by military personnel and possibly under constant observation. The effectiveness of the plan depended on the activation process, not drawing attention at any of its stages. At the same time, Olbricht was working on drafting the orders that would be transmitted by telegraph and telephone from the headquarters of the Reserve Army. He drafted a set of directives proclaiming immediate mobilization due to an attempted coup by the SS. These orders included specific instructions on the arrest of Nazi leaders, occupation of buildings, and control of media outlets. The lists of people to be arrested were prepared in detail, classifying each individual according to their position and ability to organize resistance. The instructions specified which units would be responsible for each operation and how to coordinate movements in Berlin and provinces. Ludwig Beck prepared a statement intended to be disseminated once initial control was consolidated. The text stated that the military situation demanded the restoration of order under the army's direction and announced the formation of a provisional government. It did not include explicit criticisms of Hitler, but provided a technical explanation that an extremist faction had attempted to destabilize the state. This approach sought to reduce initial resistance in the population, conditioned by years of propaganda that identified any opposition with treason. In parallel, Karl Goerdeler and other civil representatives were working on the administrative integration following the coup. They prepared lists of candidates for ministries, evaluated urgent measures to stabilize the internal economy, and discussed with foreign contacts minimal diplomatic possibilities after the fall of the Nazi regime. However, these efforts were limited by the Allied policy of unconditional surrender declared in Casablanca in January of 1943. The conspirators understood that any subsequent negotiation would be extremely difficult, but they considered that the removal of the Führer was a prerequisite for any attempt to limit future destruction. The international preparations did not significantly alter Valkyrie's operability, but they influenced the perception of urgency within the network. Each month, the Allied bombings increased, the territories controlled by Germany were reduced, and the setbacks in the east intensified. Under these circumstances, Stauffenberg insisted that acting without guarantees of success was preferable to accepting passivity that would allow the country's continuous deterioration. This logic, based on military assessment rather than on political expectations, ended up prevailing in the conspiracy. Throughout the spring of 1944, the network adjusted technical details of the plan. Internal messaging routes in Berlin were reviewed, verbal codes were established to confirm Hitler's death without transmitting explicit information. Alternative procedures were prepared in case central communications failed, and additional versions of the Valkyria orders were developed for regions with different administrative structures. Each element had to work in a continuous chain to ensure that the power transition occurred quickly enough to prevent countermeasures from the party. By June of 1944, the preparation was in its final phase. Stauffenberg had direct access to Hitler through regular meetings where he had to report on the state of mobilization. The explosive and the detonators were ready for use. Ulbricht had drafted the telegraphic orders that would activate the plan throughout Germany. The key officers in Berlin knew their immediate responsibilities. The regional networks were informed that they should act as soon as they received the mobilization signal. The conspiracy had reached a point where the action depended solely on finding the right moment to place the device close enough to the Führer and activate the sequence designed during months of preparation. In that scenario, the expectation was focused on a specific variable, the precise opportunity to initiate the entire mechanism, from detonation of the device to transmission of orders. After years of scattered planning and months of technical coordination, the functioning of Valkyrie was pending the exact instant in which Stauffenberg could execute the first action that would activate the entire operation. The opportunity to act came on the 20th of July, 1944, when Klaus von Stauffenberg was summoned again to the Wolfschanze to report on the formation of new reserve divisions. He carried in his briefcase official documentation and the explosive prepared over months. The complex, surrounded by rings of security, screened visitors through routine checks that Stauffenberg had passed without incident on previous visits, favored by his rank and by the wounds that identified him as a veteran officer. The meeting was supposed to be held in an underground bunker, but the heat of the day made Hitler order it to be moved to a wooden barrack. The change reduced the effectiveness of the charge, but Stauffenberg had no room to rethink the plan. Minutes before entering the room, he broke the chemical detonator capsule while his assistant watched the door. He could only activate one charge due to an unforeseen interruption. Upon returning, he placed the briefcase under the table near Hitler and withdrew, claiming an urgent communication. Shortly after, another officer moved the briefcase to one side of the oak support holding the table, altering the path of the explosive wave. At 12:42, the detonation destroyed the barracks and projected fragments in all directions. Stauffenberg, observing from a distance, assumed that no one had survived and left the premises, overcoming controls that had not yet received orders for a total closure. He took off for Berlin, convinced that the objective had been reached. However, Hitler had survived with moderate injuries thanks to the dispersion of the wave and the protection provided by the table. In Berlin, the conspirators were waiting for confirmation to activate Valkyrie. The initial information was contradictory, leading to critical delays. Stauffenberg arrived after 4 in the afternoon, insisting on proceeding. The orders were finally issued, mobilizing reserve army units to secure facilities and arrest SS leaders. But the news of Hitler's survival was already spreading. Joseph Goebbels obtained direct confirmation from the Wolf's Lair, and when Major Otto Ernst Remer tried to arrest him, he connected him by phone with the Führer. Remer received clear instructions and assumed control in the name of the regime. The Bendler bloc was quickly isolated. Uninvolved officers took the initiative, and General Fromm, seeking to protect himself, ordered the arrest of the conspirators. That same night, after summary proceedings, Stauffenberg, Olbricht, Haeften and Merz von Kernheim were executed in the courtyard of the building. Beck attempted suicide before the execution. The Gestapo proceeded with the total dismantling of the network through mass arrests and trials in the People's Court, where death sentences followed for months. Rommel was forced to commit suicide, Tresco took his own life at the front, and Canaris was executed in the spring of 1945. The failure of the attack allowed the regime to eliminate the last vestiges of autonomy within the Wehrmacht and intensify ideological control measures. With internal opposition neutralized, the conduct of the war became completely subordinated to the leadership that was already facing an irreversible military deterioration on all fronts. Without alternative structures capable of intervening, the evolution of the conflict would continue to be marked by decisions increasingly disconnected from operational reality that would soon be examined under a different context.